Jennifer, thank you very much for taking the time for the interview today.
So happy to be here.
We will be talking about your new book today, but I'm also very curious since we share an interest in introversion and introverted leadership. I've been doing a lot of research on introversion. I've spoken to psychologists alike. I've read like all of the material there is in scientific world. And I have seen that there is not one single definition of introversion. So I'm very, very curious to hear your definition of introversion.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I heard once somebody say, "Well, if you're an introvert, you know it." I thought that was quite interesting. And my definition, actually, Caroline, has emerged in the last 11 or 12 years that I've been working in this area. But it typically, for me, it has to do with for introverts needing time for quiet. That's kind of like, I call it in the one book, the deal breaker. It's like, if you ask an introvert, must you have quiet time? They'll say absolutely. Now, if you ask an extrovert, they kind of, it's like a nice to have versus a must have. So, it's the typical, it goes back to Carl Jung when he talked about energy sources. And I used to, when I heard that, I didn't quite get it. But then after working in this area for a while, introverts get their energy from in their heads, inside themselves, right? That's where they get re-energized. That's where they fill up the battery. And extroverts, opposite, they get deflated if they've not had that people stimulation. But where people get confused is they think introverts don't like people. And that's, we can talk about that. That's absolutely not true. Right?
Indeed, yeah. No.
Yeah. We're a good example of introvert extrovert, combination. Yeah. We can check in with each other.
Sure, yeah. So how would you explain, because you linked that to like the Carl Jung definition, that like the scientific world has abandoned all of that theory, that they went into like another path with that?
Tell me more when you say they abandoned the theory. I mean, I think it depends. Like we said, there's different viewpoints.
Yeah. Well, like the psychologists I spoke to, they don't use Carl Jung and MBTI anymore because it cannot be validated, because Carl Jung used to do experiments that you cannot reproduce. Same for MBTI.
Go on. Yeah, no. I think we're looking at one section. Yeah, there's people that feel differently about Myers-Briggs. Caroline, I'm a very practical person, so I base a lot of my data, and I know you do in yours, qualitative research and anecdotal research, and the thousands of people I've worked with. And I really came into this as a Myers-Briggs person, and I still am. But I don't base it on testing as much as I do on what people connect with. And I mentioned that I've emerged, my feelings about, or my thoughts about introversion have changed. So they haven't changed from the basic energy piece that Carl Jung talked about. I don't believe that, and we can, and there are people that disagree. Absolutely. That's what makes it interesting, right? But I think the idea of the spectrum is what I like to bring into discussions. And we hear about that in other elements of neurodiversity, right? That if we think about it as a bell curve, people can relate to that, because most people are more towards the middle, of the bell curve, right? They can go back and forth from introvert and extrovert, but they do prefer one over the other. This is what I found. Some people use the term ambiversion now. Yeah. And when I'll ask an audience, and after explaining what the difference is, between introvert, extrovert, ambivert, which is more like ambiversion of ambidextrous. I just look at what people relate to. And people do tend to identify, and they like to identify with one or the other. Yeah. Now, we do have outliers. Like in any bell curve, you have outliers, and I kind of laugh about it. But that is true that some introverts will say to me, I am a hermit. Maura Ahrens-Malley, who you may have read her book, Hiding in the Bathroom, she is a proud hermit. She is very much on the very extreme introverted side. And then you have extroverts there are some, I have a friend like that, several actually, who never stop. Busy, always have to be stimulated by outside stimulation. Yeah. Have to be talking, have to be out there. So that's kind of where I've evolved with that most people. I don't know if you have found that in your work with clients, that they identify with one or the other. Have you? What's been
Yeah.
your experience?
Well, some introverts, they only discover that they are introverted when I explain to them what it is. And then they, oh, okay, so that is what it is. They had this feeling that there was something, but they could not like put their finger on it.
Yes, yes, yes. And that's when I was a career counselor for many years and a career coach. And that's one of the other influences how I got into this work. I was working in companies and I kept seeing, I knew about Myers-Briggs and I had that defining notion about what an introvert and extrovert was. And it was so helpful to me in my marriage and my relationship as a
Mhm.
young married woman, spouse. I kind of laugh about it. I was like, my husband used to drive me crazy. Then I realized when he would go into his cave, that was absolutely necessary, right? So I started working in organizations and I kept seeing people be frustrated because they didn't fit in. You saw that too, I'm sure, that
Yeah.
they didn't fit into the norm of the extroverted ideal
Mhm.
and they weren't getting the results. They were being kind of passed over, that sort of thing. In my individual practice, that I had that same experience as you did. And it was very gratifying to see people like all of a sudden have a name, a title or a name they could identify with.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you experienced that too. And it's like, oh, and then our role, right, as coaches is to then say, there's nothing wrong with you
Exactly.
because,
Yeah.
right, that pejorative bias that people
Mhm.
internalize is very challenging.
Yeah. So you consider yourself an extrovert? When did you
I
discover
am. Yeah. Sorry. See, I jumped in there
that?
like an extrovert does, right? When
So
did I discover it? Yeah.
yeah,
When
how
did
did
I
you
discover
discover
it?
that?
I probably always knew it. When I was a young girl, I used to get in trouble for talking in school. That I would have to write "I will not talk" 100 times. That was really effective. I'm saying that facetiously. And I talked to other extroverts, and they used to get in trouble too for that. Um, I guess I came from a family that was, for the most part, pretty extroverted. Well, my dad was. And so there was a lot of permission to be expressing yourself through words. And then when I took the Myers-Briggs, that's when I had my aha experience. It all sort of made sense to me. It was so helpful.
Hmm. You already said that like it's a spectrum, so you must have some introverted things as well, right?
You may find this too. We write about what we want to learn and what we right and what we are curious about.
Hmm.
And so, now I've written 4 books on this topic. And you can't help but become more, tap into that side of yourself. And I, through this journey, I was traveling quite a bit at one point, and I was for the few years, not now, of course, but I was traveling, and I'd be alone in hotel rooms, and I'd say, okay, I'm not going to go down to the bar. I really don't want to do that. It's not comfortable for me. I'm going to stay in here, and I'm going to write, and I'm going to be quiet, or I'm going to take a walk. And slowly but surely, those kind of experiences and getting into meditation, getting into yoga, all of those Eastern sort of practices, that was the yin and the yang, that I tapped into. And I had a funny experience on this last book with my editor because Steve has been with me since the beginning, and he's a real introvert. He's a CEO introverted leader, in fact, that's why he first paid attention to my first book proposal because he was like, oh, I think I'm an introvert, introverted leader. So anyway, we've been together, 12 years now as far as a partnership. And the last meeting I had with him, he said, Jennifer, I have to tell you something. I think you've become an introvert. And I was like, I don't think so, but why do you say that? And he said, well, you come early to meetings, you're listening much more effectively, you're calmer. He started naming all these introvert qualities. And I was like, that's worth writing all the books. If I could get that he was laughing kind of a little too, because he was kidding me. But I think there was some truth to it.
Mhm.
I've evolved and I've developed,
Mhm.
and we all can. That's what I try to share with extroverts, the ones who will listen, right? The ones who will listen.
Mhm.
How you can tap into that other side. Have you found that the case with you, that you've been able to really leverage your extroverted qualities?
Yeah, for example, I have started doing improv theater to help me be more
Wow.
spontaneous and not think too much and be in my head all the time. And I really enjoy that.
How's that been? It's been fun?
It's really, really fun because I've discovered that I'm quite strong with words there as well. So I'm making like jokes that just come out spontaneously, and sometimes I'm surprising myself. So
Well, that's really, yeah, and that'll help you in your work, I'm sure.
yeah.
That's very cool because extroverts don't really filter that much, right? They just kind of have it come out. And introverts admire that, but they also get frustrated with it, of course, on many levels.
Mm-hmm.
But that's really cool that you can do that, that
Yeah,
you're
I
tapping
really
into
believe
that side.
in mutual understanding and taking the best bits of both of them and combining that. Yeah.
Totally. And, people are saying to me now, well, how are the extroverts, dealing with the pandemic? They're probably going crazy. And, in a sense, I mean, the longer it goes on with quarantine and, it is hard for a lot of extroverts. And I'm also hearing from them that they're surprised that they're actually enjoying reading books and doing little projects around the house and taking walks and connecting with people one-on-one like introverts do, having long phone conversations, all of these things that they were just keeping themselves like a wheel, hamster on a wheel, running all the time. They're like, oh, now I'm forced to do this. And it's quite refreshing to hear that. Have you heard that as well from people at all?
Some of them, yeah, but I figure that some people might be more introverted than they think, because a lot of people confuse it with shyness and they kind of stuff.
Yes.
So
Yes.
now all of a
What are you
sudden,
learning? What do you learn? A lot of people ask about that, and what about the shyness versus introversion. And my experience has been, again, based on experience, that a lot of introverts were shy as children or labeled shy because they didn't speak up and they seemed like they weren't comfortable in social situations or in school with the parenting, family outings, that kind of thing. And they kind of adopted that label, and then it really did affect them, and they confused that themselves with
yeah, yeah.
Is that something? What have you noticed about shyness or observed?
Shyness, from what I've learned, is that is something that you develop after like a bad experience, mostly a social experience, so that you don't want to get into that situation again. And so that is something that you can get rid of, whereas introversion is mainly inborn.
Yes.
You're born.
Yes, nothing's wrong with it.
No, but I think because the standard is so extroverted, I think introverts keep on telling them like, hey, I'm not like the others, which can maybe make them shy because they don't want to be rejected.
Yes, and they don't socialize. Introverts don't socialize the way extroverts do. But again, I'll use my husband as a real benchmark for me to learn. I remember when I first met his mom. She was telling me about Bill, and his family was very extroverted. They were always trying to figure him out. And she said, Jennifer, I never could understand because people were always calling him. His friends would ask to play with him. They'd come over, and Bill never spoke. He rarely spoke. He was so quiet. And there was that deeper connection he had with friendship that I still see. It's quite interesting. In other words, and that's still the case with him. And with many introverts have fewer, maybe they don't have as many people in their lives, but those relationships are so deep. And that's true in the workplace too.
Yeah.
People get to know, right?
Yeah, they're very people-centered, very interested in other people. They go really, really deep.
They go deep, right? Those journalists we were talking about earlier before we got on, right, are curious, and they really listen and they engage, and they don't just keep it at a superficial level. And so, but introverts look at it and they say, they'll look at an extrovert and they'll say, oh, they can just go in a room and they can just chat people up. And that is a skill, because extroverts enjoy it. Like as an extrovert, I'll say, the more people I can learn from at a party, like connect with and find out what's happening, I'm like a little bumblebee. I like to kind of go. And I laugh. I work with introverts when we do these sessions on networking. It's like, you know what the biggest challenge is in these sessions? What do you think it is when you're in these parties or you're socially for introverts?
To not have the impression that you need to speak to everyone.
That's part of it. But also extricating yourself, getting away from one person,
Yeah.
right? And doing it in a way that's kind of graceful, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, we work on things like that. Yeah. But I mean, those parties, if you talk to extroverts, they don't really enjoy them that much either. I mean, and the truth comes. So, I mean, the introverts network in a deeper way, and they can use social media. They can, to connect with people on LinkedIn and do it that way, to reach out, to schedule a phone call, so they're planned, like we are now, having a session and learning so much more and getting deeper with their relationship. So I think we each look at each other sometimes and we think, oh, we're envious, although extroverts don't really as much. They don't appreciate introverts enough, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it depends. Depends if they know more about what introversion is. That's
the key, Caroline. That's the key. I was running sessions in a company that was very pro-introvert. Their diversity and inclusion person was really promoting this. She had me come in, we did keynotes, we did trainings. And then at one point we decided, I have a book called The Genius of Opposites. Where am I looking over my head there? Yeah. About how introverts and extroverts make it work, how they get through those battles, to get results. And so we were promoting this program, and they said, the introverts in the classes said, it's great that we're getting empowered and we're feeling more like we're owning our strengths, our quiet strengths. But then we go back on our teams and we have people talking over us, and they don't really get this, like you said. No. So we said, okay, so then they gave me the idea to write that book on the Genius of Opposites, which I did. And then we started doing classes on it. And guess who showed up? Not the extroverts. Not the introverts, the extroverts. I'm sorry, I'm confused now. We offered it to everybody, and the majority of people who came were the introverts. The extroverts, and I kept thinking, why is that? And I would talk to people. They don't have pain yet, right? I mean, you go and get help on things when you're feeling there's a need, and they don't feel like the need. Now, as you say, people are getting more aware, and we're trying to make the case, and that's where my work is now with organizations. Like, if you don't hear from 40 to 60% of your teams, it's not just like it's a nice thing to do. Think about what you're missing as far as innovation, creativity, getting results on your projects, getting diverse viewpoints. I mean, the evidence is unequivocal now that when you have diversity on a team, different ways of looking at things, it clearly directly impacts performance of your company. Absolutely. I mean, there's no question about that anymore. So we have a very strong business case to be made for this. But it's people say it's a sprint. It's not a marathon. It's a marathon, not a sprint. I'm mixing up all my analogies this morning. But anyway, yeah, it's going to take time.
Yeah. So what made you decide to write your new book on the Creating Introvert-friendly Workplaces?
Creating Introvert-friendly Workplaces really came and emerged from the lessons that I got from the people that I've been talking with and writing about, and my readers. And, I had been focusing a lot on helping empower people through introverted leadership and quiet influence. And as I mentioned, helping introverts and extroverts on teams understand each other. But if we do that, we also have to look at, how does change really occur, and at the organizational level? How does it occur in the workplace? Are we asking people who are empowered to then go back in the workplace and have to constantly come up against structures and systems that are not supporting who they are? And so I became very curious about this, and I found there was very little, if nothing, written. I mean, I wrote a blog post, and when I Googled it, that's what came up, my blog post. So I did a survey, and I got really a lot of response. I got 240 responses, and I decided based on that to craft questions for interviews. And I went out, you mentioned Silicon Valley, I talked to different companies on the phone, and also did site visits. And I looked at what I was looking for was where were the biggest concerns that introverts have, where they felt like they were so frustrated and not being supported in their environments. And number two, where were the pockets of inclusion? Where were best practices occurring? And those weren't easy to find, but I found them in interviews and in searching. And they were, examples. So the first part of it was, we got some really compelling research results, and it was actually a mixed bag. Like, for instance, 60% of the respondents, who were mostly introverts, said that remote work was being adopted at their company. And this was before Corona. Okay. I can get hang on one sec, put it on hold a second. I'll get the rest of the results because I want to read to you a few of the stats. Okay. Hold on one sec.
Cheers.
I should have that I should post this on the wall.
So those were the interviews, or did you do like a survey as well?
This was from the survey. Yeah, this was based on the survey. Okay, so I'm ready to go. So almost 60%, this is the good news, also said it was acceptable for people in their companies to work alone, which was very surprising to me that, it was that high. About 30% observed efforts to engage introverts in meetings, only 30%. And meetings, as you've probably heard, are pain points all the time, right? Everybody hates meetings, but especially for introverts, where they're talked over and not asked about what they think, and the planning isn't done ahead of time. There's all kinds of barriers that occur. And then only 34% stated, this is again out of 240 respondents, stated that their culture supported introverts in the environment. There were a lot more stats. So those percentages got me asking more questions. But the real compelling evidence on that survey were the comments, the frustration that spilled over. And you and I have seen them. I'm sure you have too, on blog posts and on Facebook pages. And there's just so much frustration out there. And here's the challenge too. A lot of companies will not know when introverts are leaving because they're unhappy because of the fit. They just leave, they'll leave, or they check out. So they're not getting, when we talk about productivity, that's the problem. So I knew there was grist for the mill there. There was a lot to explore. And so I decided to go out and learn more. And that led me to the companies that I found as I was doing my work. I get my ideas from everywhere, from listening, from reading, like you, and found that there were examples of leaders who were very committed to this modeling. And there's lots of examples in the book. And I decided to divide up the findings into 7 key areas of work, like leadership, communication, remote work, and to look at where the challenges were for introverts, what was being done, and what you can do. And that's a third part, in addition to, finding out the survey results, finding out pockets of inclusion. Then I wanted to have, like in my other books, sort of a roadmap that you can go towards as a change agent, because anybody can be a change agent. Anyone can speak up. And so it's been very rewarding. And I look at it as a beginning, really a beginning to the conversation. Let's move into this new area, the next stage of the introvert revolution.
So how would you describe an introvert-friendly workplace?
One that embraces, or one that embraces all kinds of personality types, but is aware of introverts in every dimension. Ask that question, are we serving the variety of our personality types? Mm-hmm. Okay. Whether it be in training, whether it be in the office space design, just asking those questions, being aware, just like any element of diversity and inclusion, which is really on the minds of a lot of us right now. This question isn't oftentimes on the surface or visible. So we need to ask about different elements of diversity. It's different, like wearing different pairs of glasses. Let's look at age, let's look at gender, let's look at race. All of these things need to come into it. So an organization that has that top of mind, that from the senior leadership is talking about this and making it a priority and evaluating managers on how well they're doing in this, that makes up an introvert-friendly organization.
Could you give an example of a company that does that?
There is not one company that does that now. There's pockets that I cite in the book.
Yeah.
in companies like Bosch, and companies like Merck, and companies like 8451. And I think those companies themselves would not say that they're totally introvert friendly. It's just like saying, well, we're not racist. Or maybe that's too strong a comparison. Or where we treat women, we're totally focused on women all of the time. I think, again, it's a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd hesitate to say that there's one company yet.
Mm-hmm.
I hope there will be. That's my goal, that we could then say that, these are the top 10. We'll make a list of that. Maybe you and I can work on that together internationally.
Yeah, that would
right?
be interesting. Yeah.
Internationally. Yeah, and I think that can be driven, it's happening in different pockets of companies. So I will give you a case example that I actually use in the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's a company called 8451.
Oh yeah, I know him, Ryan. Yeah.
You know him?
Yeah, I've spoken
Ryan?
to Ryan, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Ryan actually has a case. He approached me, or somebody introduced me to him at the end of, right when I was finishing the manuscript. And he told you about his Itopia, right?
Yeah.
His Itopia. So it's just for the audience out there, they started a group based on Ryan coming up to somebody after a session, right? And who was courageous enough to say, this is difficult for me, an introvert. And he said, you know what, it's difficult for a lot of us introverts to speak up,
Mm-hmm.
but there's more issues around this too. They decided to really initiate their changes. So that, and you'll be sharing that. So that's an example of a driver. He's a director. Ryan's a director, and he is a change agent, and he's created lots of change agents. And the diversity inclusion leads, the HR leads, all are on board with this.
Mm-hmm.
And they're educating everybody about it. But Edgar Schein wrote about change, and he makes the case, and I quoted him in the book. You can't have it. I'm not going to quote him directly, but I'm going to say his idea was, you will not have change until you have it supported from the top. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're headed. That's where we're headed, getting those involved. Another example for you, Caroline McGregor, who is a executive at Merck, the pharmaceutical company. Mm-hmm. Caroline, had me come in and talk with a group of their high potential, well, that's not high potential, a retreat that they had with experienced R&D scientists, and who are my peeps. They're probably like yours. They're introverts, right? And so they need to get more educated and get more empowered and all of this good stuff. What I learned about Caroline is why she's executive sponsor of this group and has now gone around the company giving presentations about her introverted leadership style and how she identifies of all the characteristics in her life, all of her markers, her identifiers, as a Scottish person, as a woman in a minority, in a leadership position. All of those things do not compare to the fact that she's an introvert. That's her major identifier. So she gets up and talks about her struggles and how she overcame those. And I can tell you, the people I spoke with who listened to these talks have been completely bowled over and inspired. Mm-hmm. So you get lots of Carolines Caroline's talking about this, by the way, Caroline, talking about this in different companies and in one organization, and then that gives permission for others to come out. And that's how we change cultures, mm-hmm. One step at a time. But I can tell you, even though there's a lot to be done still, and I feel this about the women's movement because I'm a real activist with women, I have the advantage of having some years under my belt and working in this space for at least 12 years. And I see a real evolution. I mean, people like you, there was no such thing as an introvert coach. I would be interviewed. I had a Wall Street Journal reporter call me early on when I was doing this work. And I had written an article about it, and she wanted to get my opinion. She goes, okay, this is great. I need some real, how a journalist, you need some real mm-hmm. people. And she said, I can't get anybody to talk to me on the record who will admit at the C level, the executive level, that they are an introvert. Wow. And that, that's introvert bias. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that's still true in many cases.
Yeah. Yeah, because also in your new book you talk about anti-introvert bias, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
anti-introvert bias.
So what kind of bias have you come across during your research?
Wow, so much. Well, it started early on when I was looking at introverted leaders, and you might want to share what your experience has been. Um, One of the areas that it really does come up a lot, and I think that it has the most potential for damage, is recruiting, hiring and recruiting. And that's where I think it emerges in a very serious way. Because what we do oftentimes in companies is we don't clarify enough what the competencies are that are actually needed to get a job done, and create barriers to people who might not be all smiley and expressive, maybe not communicate as well as they could in an interview. And it's a knockout. They don't even get past the first level. Think about what we're losing. There were several examples that were shown to me or given to me by some senior HR people who said that they had been change agents, they had been advocates, they had pushed for people who were not very vibrant and maybe didn't come across so great, but they knew that they could really do great in the job. They just knew it. And based on their experience, they had all the skill sets. So why knock them out? And so they would hire them. And then these people soared to the top. But think about that, how many times that happens where it's implicit bias. Now, again, taking that recruiting, that was one example. Another, I was sitting with a group of managers and we were looking at how they could take a look at their recruiting program and their hiring program. It was more their interviewing day.
Mm-hmm.
And look at, they were taking all aspects of it. And they said, you know what, we have people come in and they have to talk to all these groups. We've all been on those interviews. They're exhausting for everybody. He said, and then after the 2 days, we have them do a presentation. They said they're exhausted. They're not their best. We're knocking those people. So it's looking at every level of the organization that there's bias. I was sitting in a training class myself, getting some training at a retreat a few years ago when I was really kind of had my antenna out. And this facilitator was there, and she goes, "We're going to do this." She was very extroverted. "We're going to do this, and we're going to go here, and then I want you to go meet with this person." And I was like, "Oh, this is bad. This is bad for everybody, but especially introverts." And one woman, to her credit, she raised her hand too. People have to speak out, right? Mm-hmm. And she said, "Are there any questions?" She goes, "We're going to go there." She goes, "You're asking us lots of questions. It really, for the introverts in the room, this is just too much. Can we take some time to think? Can we write down our responses and reflect?" And the trainer said, "Oh, really?" Yeah, she was like shocked. She said, "Oh, I guess you could do that." But of course, when that happened, the results were so much richer, mm-hmm. The responses.
Yeah.
So it's like, I've heard so many pockets of these sort of examples of where we just like, let's stop. Do you have an agenda for this meeting? So there's just so many different aspects. I mentioned there's 7 areas I looked at. And so if you can think of each one of these has bias in them. I mentioned the recruiting. I mentioned the workplace design, how we design offices. And that's going to be interesting now as we're starting to go back to offices.
Definitely.
We need more space. Do you think introverts will like that? Yeah.
More space, not like the open plan offices.
More space within the open plan.
Yeah. And a different setup, I would say.
Many introverts talked about in their comments about how even though there might have been a quiet room or a separate room to do work in some of the modern open spaces, they were quickly taken over by storage or meetings. So, we're not going to be able to have these small meetings, but who knows? Yeah. So office space design, I looked at leadership, communication, training. There's one more. Learning and development was another one. Teamwork, how teams work together. Yeah. So some of those 7 areas, and then gave people some ideas for what they could do.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned leadership. Well, mm-hmm. What I've seen is that more extroverted leaders often are not really aware of the preferences of introverts. So What would your advice be for extroverted leaders?
Yeah, I'll tell you, and just a quick anecdote. I was hired with this technology consulting firm, and the person who hired me, I didn't realize this till after I got there, unfortunately. So it was an uphill battle. Important to do more due diligence. But this woman said to me, listen, I know you're talking about introverted leadership. I want these guys to become extroverts. She didn't really reveal it to me till I got there. So can you imagine? I mean, this is anti-introverted leadership, right? Yeah. I mean, she came out, at least she came out and said it. Some people are a little more subtle, but they still believe that. Mm-hmm. They think the extroverted ideal. Well, I kind of laugh with that, but a lot of times it's about just being quiet and listening, right? And getting to know people. These one-on-one meetings are very important. We know that in effective manager-employee relationships anyway, that you need to make that a priority for coaching, for finding out where you can share the mission and vision that you're trying to execute, and can align that with the work of people. We know that in general, but introverts will really appreciate that one-on-one versus doing that always in meetings, right? So as a leader, you want to look at how you're communicating. How are you setting boundaries too, and communicating those expectations? So an example is with work from home now. I'm hearing from a lot of introverts that they're exhausted, partly because of the Zoom meetings and everything, and there's too many of those. But it's also they're working all the time. You know how that can happen. Mm-hmm. And their managers are not helping them set boundaries. And they're sending emails at 2 a.m. So they're expected. Yeah, so I think it's really about connecting with all of your employees, but especially your introverts, so that you can understand what's going on with them, because they're not going to necessarily bring that up to you when they're having concerns and challenges. So making the space for that, mm-hmm. and not trying to take things over, to really listen, right? Listen. Let them also communicate to you through writing. And one of the things I've been trying to advise people now is to utilize on these virtual calls and with Slack and all these programs, use the chat, because don't expect people just always to talk.
Mm-hmm. What would introverts do themselves if they work in a workplace that is not that introvert friendly? How can they make that a priority?
Well, that's such a good question. First of all, it depends on what the issue is. They need to get in touch themselves with what the concern and challenge is. So that's a little bit broad to say, well, is it not introvert friendly? You have to analyze what the problem is. Maybe it's not an introvert issue, right? But if it is, if you're not being heard, for instance, you need to have some allies to kind of talk to about this, and to get clear about having a communication with your manager or with your team. I think one of the things that's been helpful is to, with some of these groups, the ERG groups, is to have, like I mentioned, the Itopia. I'd like to see more of that, where introverts can share with other introverts. In the classes that I've taught and facilitated, I would say the most effective piece of that class is the fact that people chat together, in convening conversations. That's what I'm really trying to do now. More is getting people to talk about their concerns, and then problem solving, like you do in coaching, to help them figure a way to approach that leader, to register the concern in real time, like I mentioned. I have a couple of things here that I want to share that in the book about being a change agent. Mm-hmm. And I think that can apply here as well. There's a quiz as well that I'd encourage people to take, so they don't get overwhelmed. It's on my website too, jenniferkahnweiler.com, but it's also in the book. And it helps you kind of figure out where it's going well for you, as far as your team and your workplace, mm-hmm. and where there's opportunities to work on things.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that would be, that would be good. The quiz is on the website too.
Okay.
So starting conversations is one thing that I talk about. Involving other introverts in the research. If we all think that this is not conducive, let's look at what's happening and present a proposal. I remember when I first put something forward when I had small kids and nobody was doing work at home. And I was like, I can't work here every day. I need some flexibility. I need to cut back a little bit. Everybody's like, oh, you're going to really do that? And I made a business case for it. So how can you work with other people to make a business case, right? Yeah. And bringing it up to senior leadership, bringing it up in your teams, as you said, Caroline, it's about talking about the elephant in the room and educating other people. It's when people understand about this, then there's much more acceptance, like anything else. You know, years ago, I remember when I was facilitating a workshop on introverts, there was a team that came together from a local university. They had attended it together. And it came out in the discussion that they were very frustrated with one of their team members because she never left the office. That's when we had private offices. She never left. She closed her door at lunch, and they all, mostly extroverts, wanted to go, have you been there? Socialize, right? And hang out together.
Yeah.
And so they were getting increasingly frustrated with her. And she turned to them. I remember her face right now. She turned to them, and they were sitting like in a row, and she said, guys, I just need alone time. I need a break at lunch. I'm an introvert. And if I don't get that break, I'm going to be very testy and frustrated to work with in the afternoon when you are hanging out with me. And they said, really? We didn't know you were an introvert. What does that mean? You know, she started explaining. How does that show up for you? It was illuminating. And I did talk with that team afterwards, and they told me it was really a breakthrough.
Yeah.
It's not a big deal. So that's kind of what we find, right? When people talk, get the elephant out of the room.
Exactly. Yeah. So do you see a certain role there for introverted leaders as well?
What do you mean role?
To put that on the agenda of a company because they know so much more about how it is to be an introvert.
I think yes. And they say that in improv, right? You were talking about improv.
Exactly.
Yes, or yeah. And is it that way they say? Yeah.
Yes, and yeah, it's never no, but.
So yeah, absolutely. Introverted leaders, like I mentioned, like Caroline, and others can really make a difference in modeling and leading the way. But I have felt my role as an ally and an advocate is very important too. And we're talking about that a lot now in different areas of diversity, that it's very important to speak up for introverts and to educate yourself about what that looks like, and then question and always have that lens of like, oh, are we serving the introverts? When I design this meeting, am I having some breaks in there, or am I allowing people to just write their thoughts instead of constantly brainstorming? Let's do brainwriting. I can tell you, introverts have told me they have so much gratitude when somebody actually thinks of them and thinks of what's the best way for them to get this information, and ask them, like, how many breaks should we build into this day? Is this working for you? How could we make it more introvert friendly? You know, Caroline, so I think together, whether we're introverts, extroverts, we can all make a shift with this idea of inclusivity for introverts.
So how do you think we could create more mutual understanding between introverts and extroverts for them to really see each other's strength instead of like what they don't have?
Well, my focus is the workplace. And what I'm increasingly realizing is that people relate to stories. They remember stories 22 times more than they do just giving them content, giving them descriptions. And where they resonate is thinking about their family, their friends. And when you can relate it to people and their understanding of why maybe they're coming up against frustrations with their spouse or their child or their sister or brother, and they have that lens to look through, those eyeglasses, then it's like, oh yeah. And you know, and I'm thinking about my team right now, and who might be introverts, extroverts. Let's bring this up. Let's do an assessment. Let's kind of see the composition of our team. Do we have enough diversity? They start asking the questions. Once they can personally relate. Sorry about that, my phone going off. Once they can personally relate. So that's been my biggest, I think my biggest learning throughout all this, Caroline, is like, let's bring it down to ourselves. And then we can, just like I talked about with Bill, my husband, that's what got me into working in the workplace and saying, this is important content. We all need to be talking about this.
Yeah, and make it personal. Yeah. Yeah, that's really good advice indeed, to make it very relatable for other people. Yeah, definitely. So what is your end point? When is your work done here?
When is my work done? You mean looking ahead in the future?
Yeah, like what do you want companies to achieve in this field of introversion and being introvert friendly?
I want us not to have to keep educating people that introversion is a part of just how we define ourselves, our teams, as one aspect of it that's totally accepted and embraced, that's looked at as a strength, that our systems are all designed within the workplace to accommodate and to include, not so much accommodate, but include introverts, so that we have a balanced workforce that then creates, really, just like within ourselves, where we're balanced and we're tapping into both sides, we're able to tap into all the beautiful strengths of introverts, extroverts, ambiverts, and everybody else. It's very beautiful picture as I look ahead. So
I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much for your work and for having me.